The room fell silent when the stranger placed the pouch of gold on the table. Its weight thudded against the cracked wood, echoing louder than any scream Xena could have let out. Her mother glanced at it, just a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, before her father's calloused hand moved swiftly, pulling the pouch toward him as if he'd been waiting his whole life for its touch. Xena stood in the corner, her fists clenched, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and rising panic. She knew what this meant. She had heard the whispers around the village, the rumors of this man from the far west who traveled alone, carrying gold, marrying girls no one else dared to touch. And now her name had fallen from his lips. The stranger didn't speak much. His eyes were sharp, almost too quiet, like a man who'd buried his own soul long ago. He looked at Xena only once, a fleeting glance as if checking to see if she was still alive. That was all it took for Xena to feel a chill settle in her bones. There was no kindness in his expression, but no cruelty either, just a strange, aching emptiness that mirrored something she couldn't quite name. Her father cleared his throat and spoke the word she had prayed never to hear, "We accept." Xena staggered forward, her voice finally returning raw and cracked. "You said you would never do this. You said I could choose." "We are choosing for you," her father cut in sharply. "This is for the family, for survival. Do you want your brothers to starve? Your mother to beg at the market? Do you want to see this house fall apart with no roof over our heads? He is offering us a future." Xena turned to her mother, hoping for softness, but all she saw was exhaustion, years of sacrifice etched into lines that had deepened too soon. "It's just one marriage," her mother said quietly. "You'll adjust. Women always do." The word struck Xena like a slap. One marriage? To a man no one knew, for a price that made her feel like nothing more than an item on a merchant's shelf? That night the air in their hut grew heavy. Xena sat outside beneath the neem tree, tracing the dirt with a stick as her heart spiraled with questions. Was her worth so easily measured in coins? She wasn't even 18 yet, hadn't seen beyond the village boundary, hadn't danced freely since her mother fell sick. Her dreams had been small, planting herbs, healing women, singing to children, but they were hers. Now they were being traded for metal. The next morning, preparations began. The village women brought out red cloth and incense. Some congratulated her with hollow eyes, while others avoided her gaze entirely. They had seen this story before. They had watched girls vanish into lives they never chose, only to return years later, hardened or broken, or never return at all. Her younger brother, Malik, found her near the riverbank. "Are you really going?" he asked, his voice trembling like the reeds in the wind. Xena tried to smile, but her lips refused to cooperate. "It looks like I am." "But he's strange," Malik whispered. "He doesn't smile. He didn't even ask you anything. Shouldn't you at least know his name?" "I know enough," she replied, her voice bitter. "He is gold. That's all that matters here." Her hands trembled as she reached for Malik's, holding them tightly, memorizing his warmth. She wanted to freeze that moment, to remember what it felt like to be wanted not for what she could offer but just for existing. When the wedding day came, the drums beat louder than her thoughts. She stood in crimson cloth, face veiled, heart racing. The stranger arrived at sunset, his silhouette casting long shadows on the earth. The elders said a few words, the fire was lit, and Xena felt her spirit detach as the ritual was completed. She didn't remember the chants. She didn't remember saying yes. She only remembered the final silence, the moment the crowd dispersed and her world shifted. Her father gave a nod of approval. Her mother cried quietly into her shawl. Xena looked back at her home one last time, then stepped toward the stranger's horse, her feet heavy as stone. As they rode away, the village fading behind her, the gold left on her family's table began to lose its luster in her mind. Every jingle from the stranger's saddlebag was a cruel reminder. Her life had been exchanged like cattle at the market. She was no longer a daughter, not a girl with dreams, just a possession in a stranger's story. But beneath all the sorrow and betrayal, a seed of something else stirred, rage. A quiet, smoldering rage that refused to let her drown. If they thought she would vanish into silence, they didn't know her. They didn't know that she would carry her pain like a torch, that she would not let her story end with a bargain made in the dark. She would find out who this stranger really was. And someday she would make them all remember the name they tried to sell. Xena stood at the edge of her family's compound, her small bag clutched tightly in her hand, the early morning mist wrapping around her like a shroud. Her eyes were red from a night of silent weeping, her throat dry from the things she wanted to scream but never did. The sky above was dull and heavy as if it too mourned the parting. The stranger, tall and cloaked in layers of dark fabric, waited by the donkey cart that would take her away, his expression unreadable beneath his hood. Xena had never spoken more than a few words to him, and those had been forced, ceremonial phrases at the rushed wedding 3 days earlier. Her parents, however, had spoken volumes in the hush of night, counting the gold coins he'd brought and whispering dreams of a new roof and goat's fat with milk. She turned slightly, looking back at her home one last time, her gaze locking with that of her younger brother, Malik. He was crouched behind the fence, his small face pale and drawn, eyes wide and pleading. He had not stopped asking questions since the day the stranger had arrived. Why him? Why now? Why Xena? He was only 10, but he had seen enough to know that his sister's smile had been swallowed by fear. Xena had tried to comfort him in whispers, promising she'd return, that things would be fine, but even as she spoke the words, they turned to ash in her mouth. Her mother approached then, adjusting the shawl on Xena's shoulders and pretending to brush dust from her cheeks, but really it was an excuse to avoid her daughter's eyes. Be a good wife, she said in a brutal voice, her own guilt masked by practiced tradition. He's your husband now. Make your family proud. Xena nodded, because what else could she do? Her protests had been ignored, her tears dismissed. Her father, once tender with her, had turned stone-faced the moment the coins were laid on the mat. The spirits don't wait forever, he had said when she pleaded to be spared. This is a good match. You'll see. She didn't see. All she saw was the cart and the man, and the road that stretched like a curse into the unknown. She stepped toward it slowly, her feet heavy with dread. The stranger extended his hand to help her in, and for a moment she hesitated. His hand was clean, nails trimmed, skin smooth, not what she had expected. She had imagined claws, coldness, or the firm grip of someone who bought wives as one would cattle. But his hand was steady and warm, and when she finally took it, something flickered in his eyes, something not cruel but heavy. She wasn't sure what to make of it. Malik rushed forward as the cart began to move. He grabbed the side, running alongside it, breathless and stubborn. Xena, he called. Don't go. They didn't even ask you. Why are they making you go? The driver snapped the reins gently, and the donkey began to move faster. Malik stumbled, tears running down his cheeks. Come back, he shouted. I'll save up, I'll get the gold back. Xena couldn't take it anymore. She turned around in the cart and reached toward him, her hand outstretched. Malik, go home, she cried. Take care of Mama. Be strong for me. But her voice cracked, and a sob escaped before she could choke it down. The stranger said nothing, only watched the scene quietly as the cart rolled forward and Malik's voice grew fainter behind them. The village disappeared behind the tall acacia trees, and the silence stretched between Xena and the man beside her. She kept her eyes on the road, refusing to let the tears fall again. Her whole body ached, not from labor but from helplessness. She didn't know where they were going, only that it was far. The stranger had said little during the brief ceremony, and less during the exchange. All she knew was his name, Bako. As they moved further from everything she knew, Xena began to feel as though the girl she had been was slowly dissolving behind her. In her place, a shadow version formed, quiet, obedient, numb. She did not know what kind of man Bako would reveal himself to be once they reached his home. Her imagination painted grim possibilities, all worse than the last. Would he strike her? Lock her away? Or worse, demand affection she could never give? And yet, there was that strange warmth in his hand earlier. And when Malik screamed for her to stay, Bako's head had dipped slightly as if in regret. That didn't fit the image of a cruel man. But Xena knew better than to trust hope. Hope had failed her too many times before. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the dirt path. Birds scattered from the bushes as the cart rolled on. Xena dared a glance at the man beside her. His eyes were closed now, or perhaps just turned away from her, giving her space. Maybe he knew this journey wasn't only miles, it was something deeper. A tearing away of roots. A breaking of spirit. Still she didn't cry again. She couldn't. Not yet. She wrapped her shawl tighter and leaned back into the cart, trying to slow her racing heart. The silence would have to speak for her now. And in that silence, even the wind seemed to carry her brother's last words. Come back. Xena stepped over the threshold of the house, the wooden floor creaking beneath her feet like it hadn't felt movement in years. The door shut behind her with a hollow thud, and she felt the silence swallow her whole. The house was large, built of dark wood and stone, with narrow windows that let in very little light. The air inside was still, too still, as if it was holding its breath. Dust floated in the dim shafts of sunlight, catching the motes like silent memories. The stranger, her husband now, said nothing as he guided her through the corridors. She didn't even know his name. Each hallway seemed longer than the last, winding in a way that made the house feel alive. The doors they passed were shut, their knobs rusted or covered with thick cloth. She noticed carvings in the beams, spirals, crosses, and shapes she didn't recognize, etched into the wood like old scars. Some had been clawed over or blackened by soot. When she asked what they meant, he only looked at her with tired eyes and said, "They're protections." She was led to a small room at the far end of the upper floor. The window was narrow and barred. The bed looked barely used. There were no mirrors in the room, no personal belongings, nothing to suggest anyone had lived there before. He left her alone without a word. When the door shut, she heard a faint click, not of a lock but of something older, deeper in the wood. She tested the handle. It turned freely. She wasn't locked in. Not yet. That night, the silence was louder than any scream. The floorboards creaked in places where no one walked. Wind brushed the window but didn't howl. Instead, it murmured, unintelligible but rhythmic. Xena wrapped herself in the blanket and stared at the ceiling, where the same symbols from the hallways were carved into the beams above her. She didn't remember falling asleep, only waking up with a sharp breath at dawn, her throat dry and her palms clammy. In the days that followed, she tried to make sense of her new home. Her husband, whom she learned was named Toma, spoke very little. He left early each morning and returned late, always with wood or herbs, sometimes with raw meat. He never asked her to cook or clean. He simply gave her space. But the house did not. The rooms changed. Doors that were closed one day stood slightly ajar the next. When she peered into them, they were often empty, except for strange things. An old doll missing its face, a chair that rocked on its own, a mirror covered with thick cloth and bound by string. She stopped entering them altogether. One morning, she woke to find a piece of bread on the windowsill, half-eaten, and a set of muddy footprints on the floor leading to her bed. She showed them to Toma. He nodded slowly, then fetched a bowl of ash and poured it in a circle around her bed. "Stay inside the circle when you sleep," he said. "What is this place?" she asked. His eyes darkened. "A resting house." She didn't understand, not then. But the whispers began to grow clearer. At first, they were just murmurs at night, behind the walls or under the floor. Then she began hearing her name, soft, pleading. Xena. Xena? Sometimes she thought it was her younger brother's voice. Other times it was a woman's voice, cracked with sorrow. She pressed her hands to her ears and tried to block it out. Toma began sleeping in the hall outside her room. When she asked why, he only said, "They don't like when I go too far." On the fourth day she ventured to the southern wing. The air was colder there. The doors were heavier. One room had dozens of dolls nailed to the walls, all with black thread sewn over their eyes. Another had a pool of water in the middle of the floor, dark and unmoving, though there were no pipes. When she looked into it, she didn't see her reflection, only trees swaying in a storm. She ran back to her room and didn't leave it until Toma returned. That evening they sat in silence by a fire he built in the hearth. The warmth felt real. She stared at the flames, hoping they would melt away her fear. "This house belonged to my mother," he said at last. Xena looked up. He had never spoken so openly. She was a seer. People came here to speak to the dead. She taught me things, how to listen, how to see behind the veil. But it cost her. The spirits grew angry when she stopped serving them. They began to linger. Not all of them were kind. Xena whispered, "And now they linger still?" He nodded. "This house, it keeps their grief. Some want a rest. Others want revenge." "Why bring me here?" she asked, her voice trembling. His hands clenched. "Because you saw what others didn't. The pain in your eyes, I knew it. I thought, maybe you wouldn't be afraid." "I am," she admitted. "I'm terrified." He looked at her then, truly looked. "Good. Fear means you're still alive." That night she broke the ash circle. She needed answers. Something was pulling her, calling her name more clearly now. She lit a candle and followed the sound, barefoot, heart racing. Down the stairs, through the central hallway, past the door she was told never to open. It was ajar. Inside was a small chamber, lined with shelves of jars filled with herbs and bones. Symbols were carved into the floor in a spiraling pattern. At the center was a cracked mirror, uncovered. And from it, Xena saw not herself but a girl, younger, thinner, with eyes filled with fire. The girl opened her mouth but no sound came out. Suddenly, Xena was pulled back, strong arms around her waist. It was Toma. "You weren't supposed to go in there," he growled. "It's not safe." "Who is she?" Xena demanded. He didn't answer. He dragged her back to her room and reinforced the ash line. "Do not follow the voices again," he said, "or they'll take you." The next morning the mirror was gone. So was the chamber. Xena began writing everything down. She couldn't forget what she saw. Her fear became sharper but also clearer. She understood now that the house held pain older than her own, grief carved into its bones. But it was also keeping something from her. A secret. And the house didn't want her to find it. Still she listened. Still she searched. Because something told her that the stranger's silence held more than sorrow. It held the key to her survival. And maybe even her revenge. The days passed like slow-moving shadows, thick with unspoken words and the weight of secrets. Xena had become familiar with the silence that cloaked the house like an old shroud, but lately that silence had started to shift. It was in the way the stranger moved, in the way his eyes lingered just a little longer, as though he was fighting an urge, not of anger or control, but of truth clawing to be spoken. She noticed it first when he handed her a steaming bowl of soup on a rainy night. His hand trembled. Not from the cold, the fire was roaring, but from something buried deeper. Something that made his knuckles tense and his lips pressed together in restraint. She took the bowl, nodded her thanks and sat beside the hearth. He sat too, opposite her, and for a few moments they shared the silence like a blanket. Then she saw it, a small scar just below his jawline. It looked like a burn, round and faded but still visible. Her eyes lingered a second too long. When he caught her gaze he didn't look away. Instead he touched the scar lightly, then spoke for the first time in 2 days. "Hot iron," he said, voice gravelly. "Pressed there when I was 15. Xena blinked. The words hung in the air, sharp and brittle. She hadn't expected him to speak, let alone about pain. She watched him, unsure whether to ask for more or stay silent. He seemed to read her confusion. "They said I disrespected a chief's daughter. But all I did was say she looked lonely." Xena swallowed, suddenly feeling her own body respond, goosebumps up her arms, a tightening in her chest. She didn't speak, but she leaned forward, as though proximity could translate into understanding. He continued quietly. "My father accepted the punishment. Said it would teach me my place. He took the gold they gave him. Bought 3 goats with it." Xena felt the sting in his voice. A sharp, dry bitterness that she knew well. She looked down at her own hands, the small calluses forming at the base of her thumbs from the housework, the dried blood still under one fingernail from a splintered broom. Suddenly she asked, "Do you hate them?" He didn't answer right away. The fire crackled. Rain tapped lightly on the roof. "I used to," he said. "Until I realized they were just broken in ways they never admitted. So they broke me." Xena nodded slowly. "I think mine are the same. Except they pretend not to be broken. They laugh too loudly. They eat too much when they're scared." He looked at her. "And they sold you for gold." She met his gaze. "Enough to feed the whole family for a year. Maybe 2. They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't hollow. It was full, of recognition, of buried stories pushing gently to the surface. That night, Xena didn't sleep right away. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and thinking about the burn on his neck, the goats bought with his suffering. She wondered what had been bought with her suffering. Flour? A new roof? A better future for her little brother? The next day she found herself wandering the house again. The compound remained cold, but her fear of it had dulled. The symbols still etched into doorframes and beams no longer looked threatening, they looked like stories. Like memories scratched into wood. She found one shaped like a spiral, carved into the back of a cupboard. She touched it gently, then turned when she heard footsteps. He stood at the doorway, arms crossed. "That one's from my mother," he said. "It's meant to protect the soul." "She believed in that?" Xena asked. He nodded. "She tried to protect me. Quietly. When she could. But she couldn't stop what happened. So she gave me symbols." Xena smiled faintly. "My mother gave me songs. When my stepfather wasn't listening, she'd whisper them into my ear. Said if I remembered the songs, I'd never forget who I was." There was something strange and sacred about the exchange, like 2 pieces of broken pottery finding their shared crack. Day by day the house grew warmer, not in temperature but in atmosphere. He started opening more doors. The kitchen became theirs instead of just his. She made porridge one morning and he brought her berries from the nearby trees. He still didn't talk much, but when he did, it always mattered. One afternoon, as they gathered herbs in the small garden out back, Xena asked, "What's your name?" He looked up from the leaves in his hand, surprised. Then he said, "Mosi." She whispered it to herself. "Mosi. And yours?" he asked, though she knew he'd heard it from her family that day. Zina, she said. It means secret. He smiled faintly. And mine means firstborn. They laughed, soft and cautious, like children trying out the sound of joy. Later Mosi showed her a locked room. She hesitated when he held out the key, but he nodded. It's time, he said. Inside was a room filled with wooden masks and old garments, dried herbs and carved sticks. It looked like an ancestral shrine, but one abandoned and left to age. Zina stepped in slowly, touching each object with reverence. This was my grandfather's, he said. He was a healer. Until he was accused of sorcery. They locked him up. Like you. Like me. Zina turned to him, eyes wide. They chained you too? He nodded. Different chains. Guilt. Silence. Shame. Chains don't always clang. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. Do they ever break? He walked to her, placed one hand on her shoulder. They can. But they leave marks. Just like burns. And for the first time since arriving, Zina allowed herself to cry. Not quietly, not into her pillow, but openly, in front of him. She cried for her lost childhood, her mother's silence, her brother's fearful eyes as she was taken away. Mosi didn't speak. He simply stood there, allowing the room to hold them both, scars and all. After that day, Zina and Mosi began to share more. Not just stories, but the small, sacred things that make a life. Favorite spices, memories of rainy days, games once played with siblings. She told him about a tree near her home that she used to climb when things got too loud. He told her about a river he once followed for miles, hoping it would lead him away from everything. And then one evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and bathed the compound in orange light, Zina said, "You're not what I feared." Mosi turned. "And you're not what I expected." She smiled. "Maybe we're what each other needed." The words were simple, but in them lay the ache of all they had lost, and the hope of what they might still find. They didn't promise love. They didn't need to. What they offered one another was more powerful. Understanding, shared survival, and a quiet beginning. In the days that followed, Zina started painting. Using crushed berries and herbs, she added color to the house's walls, tracing the symbols into patterns that told their stories. Mosi carved a new walking stick, not because he needed it but because he said it reminded him of his grandfather. The house was no longer silent. It held music again, not sung aloud but felt in footsteps, in laughter, in the rustling of pages and the whisper of healing. Together they were still figuring things out. There were days when silence returned, not as a punishment but as reflection. There were nights when the past knocked again, reminding them of what they had endured. But in those moments they reached for each other, not to erase the pain but to carry it together. The storm rolled in without warning, loud and vengeful, tearing across the sky like an old god waking from a deep sleep. Rain slammed against the windows of the lonely house, and the wind howled through the gaps in the wooden frames like voices long buried. Zina sat curled near the fireplace, the only source of warmth in the cold, echoing walls that surrounded her. The flames crackled and danced, casting strange shadows on the walls, but it was the man sitting across from her who held her gaze. The stranger, her husband by a bargain not of her choosing, was staring into the fire, his jaw clenched, eyes dark and unreadable. They had barely spoken since her arrival weeks ago, each living in a quiet tension, bound by a marriage neither wanted, a house that whispered secrets and a silence that suffocated. But something about tonight felt different. Lightning lit the sky, and in that momentary flash she saw his hand tremble slightly as he held a chipped mug close to his lips. She'd never seen him afraid before, distant, yes, closed off certainly, but never fragile. And in that flicker of weakness she saw something all too familiar. Hidden, guarded pain. "Do you hear them?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Zina stiffened. "The wind." He shook his head. "No. The ones who came before." She stared at him. Her heart quickened. "You mean the women?" He didn't answer. Instead he set the mug down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, face illuminated by firelight. His eyes didn't meet hers, but his voice, low and tired, filled the room. "They sent you here, didn't they? Your family. Sold you off like a prize goat." Zina swallowed. The words were too sharp, too real. "They needed gold," she said softly. "They said this marriage would save them." He gave a bitter laugh. "Same as mine. Only I wasn't sold, my sister was." Zina blinked. "Your sister?" He nodded, voice growing rough. "Her name was Inira. She was everything. Brave. Wild. too wild for the village. My father said he had to tame her. That the only way to protect the family's name was to marry her off, to a man who offered more gold than anyone had seen in years. A long silence fell between them, broken only by the popping of the fire and the distant growl of thunder. Xena didn't speak, didn't move. Every part of her wanted to listen, not just out of curiosity but because she knew the pain of being bartered like an object, of being locked in a fate you never chose. She was 16, he continued. She cried, begged, screamed. But they made her go. We never saw her again. What happened to her? Xena whispered. His voice faltered. The man, he was cursed. Or maybe he carried something darker. One by one, every girl married into his home disappeared. They called it ill luck. But my sister, she wasn't weak. She tried to escape. They said she fell into the river and drowned. Xena's breath caught. Do you believe that? He looked up then, eyes burning. No. The firelight flickered and she could see now how deep the wounds went, not on his skin but in his soul. This stranger who had seemed so unreadable, so distant, wasn't just a man trapped in his own silence. He was haunted. They blamed her, he said. Said she brought shame. That her death was a punishment. My father said if I ever spoke her name again, I'd meet the same fate. But you never forgot, Xena said gently. He shook his head. I never will. The room felt heavier now, as if the walls were listening. The storm roared louder, thunder shaking the ground, and the wind cried through the cracks. You married me because? She asked, her voice trembling. Because my family made a bargain, he replied. The same gold that bought my sister's death was used to bind me in this deal. I was the last son. They wanted to clean the stain of her memory. They said marrying a good girl, a quiet one, would restore honor. Xena felt tears rise, but she held them back. They thought I would be obedient. He gave a tired smile. So did mine. For the first time since she entered that house, she didn't feel alone. Their lives had been shattered in different ways, but both had been forged in fire, in betrayal, in silence. And now here they were, two strangers in a cursed house, bound not just by gold or family but by shared loss. I see her in you, he said quietly. You look at this world with the same fury. The same unwillingness to bend. Xena stared at him, the firelight making his face softer than she'd ever seen it. Then maybe it's time we both stop bending. The storm outside began to fade, its rage passing. Inside, the silence between them felt different now, no longer cold but heavy with understanding. In that moment, Xena knew that the stranger was no longer a stranger. He was a mirror of her suffering and perhaps, the only one who could help her survive it. And maybe, just maybe, together they could find the truth that had been buried beneath gold and shame, and finally bring justice to the ghosts still whispering in the firelight. They returned under the cloak of night, cloaked in worn robes and wide-brimmed hats that masked their faces. Xena barely recognized the edges of her village anymore. The thatched rooftops, once comforting, now loomed like silent watchers. Each step closer to her past sent a chill crawling up her spine. The stranger walked beside her, eyes scanning every movement in the shadows, every whisper of wind like a memory tugging at him. The two no longer spoke freely, not here. Their silence wasn't out of fear of each other, it was fear of being heard. They posed as traders, bearing fake names and a cart of hollow crates. But their true intent was buried deeper, to unearth the truth behind the curse tied to these cruel marriages of gold and blood. Xena's family had taken gold from a man they didn't know, exchanged her future for glittering coins that disappeared the moment the stranger took her away. And she wasn't the first. Nor would she be the last, unless they stopped it. They stayed in the home of an old widow on the outskirts of the village. She didn't ask questions, only offered food in exchange for labor, and kept her gaze averted from the stranger's scarred hands. At night, Xena lit a small candle and laid out the fragments of letters she had stolen from the forbidden room. Some bore the names of women who had vanished. Others had only symbols, an eye with 3 lashes, a circle pierced by bone. The same symbols she had seen carved into wood back at the stranger's house. The same ones that now reappeared faintly around the village. They're part of an old marking, the stranger whispered, tracing one with his finger on the old map they had found. A ritual branding, maybe. They were used in deals long before either of us were born. The deeper they dug, the more they learned. An old man who once served as a village clerk remembered a ceremony held every 15 years, always behind closed doors in the council house. He never saw what happened, but he remembered the aftermath. A new grave, a new house, a sudden disappearance. One afternoon, Xena snuck into the village archives. Dust coated the old scrolls like layers of silence, and most were rotted beyond reading. But in the back, buried beneath broken slates, was a blood-stained ledger. It listed names, dates, and objects received in return: jewelry, land, livestock, gold. And next to each item, a single woman's name. Zena's name was there too. Dated just months ago. She felt her breath freeze. "They kept track of us like cattle," she whispered. The stranger read over her shoulder. His jaw clenched when he saw his sister's name 2 pages above Zena's. She had been traded for silver and a ceremonial spear. "I thought my father was desperate when he let them take her," he murmured, "but he was rewarded." The truth was uglier than they imagined. The gold exchanged in these marriages didn't go to feed families or build homes. It went into the hands of the village elders, a closed circle who had long relied on an ancestral deal. Long ago, the ancestors had made a pact with an unseen force, a spirit of protection and prosperity, in return for sacrifices dressed as marriage. Every generation, a woman would be given away, sealed in a life she did not choose, and the village would prosper. Crops would grow, rain would come, enemies would fall. No one had dared to question it. Those who did were silenced, erased from history like the sisters, daughters, and mothers before them. Zena and the stranger made a silent vow that night. They would gather proof, real proof, of the ritual's existence. They began collecting symbols, interviewing the few brave elders willing to whisper truths after enough drink, and tracing patterns in the soil of long-forgotten graves. Each discovery was heavy. Each truth another nail in the village's coffin. The curse was real. But it wasn't magic alone that bound them. It was belief. It was silence. In the forest just beyond the village, they unearthed a cracked stone altar half swallowed by roots. Around it were rings of ash, melted gold, and scorched cloth. Burnt offerings. Sacrificial fires. Pieces of the brides. Zena wept there, not because of what she saw but because she understood now that none of this had ever been about love or family. It was control. Fear. Greed. But now she had names. She had the ledger. She had scars of her own. Back in the widow's hut, they packed what they had, scrolls, maps, bone trinkets, and prepared to confront the council. The time for hiding had ended. The fire inside them both now burned with more than vengeance. It burned with justice. The council hut stood in the center of the village, its mud walls painted with ancestral sigils, its thatched roof looming like a crown of bones. Zena had passed it 1,000 times as a girl, never once imagining that behind those walls, her future had been sold before she even learned to dream. Now she stood before it not as a daughter or a victim but as a witness, and a storm. She pushed open the doors, the stranger behind her, carrying the ledger wrapped in torn cloth. The elders sat in a semicircle, shrouded in ceremonial robes, eyes sharp despite their age. Her father sat among them. His beard was grayer now but his face held no shame. Only weariness. Perhaps a flicker of fear. Zena's voice cut the silence like a blade. "Do you remember what you traded me for?" No one spoke. She walked forward and threw the ledger to the ground. Pages fanned out like wings, pages filled with names of women, dates, and the price of their lives. "These are not records. These are tombstones." Still they were silent. The stranger stepped forward and unrolled one of the scrolls they had taken from the forest. A binding charm in ancient ink, marked with the same sigils carved into the altar stones. "You didn't just marry off daughters. You sealed them in blood-bound pacts. With something that never dies." One elder, the oldest among them, finally spoke. "We did what we had to. The rains returned. The war never touched us. Our children didn't starve. Our children were the price." Zena shouted. "Our sisters, your wives, you sacrificed them in gold-wrapped weddings and buried them beneath lies." Her father rose, his face pale. "Zena, I did not know the truth until it was too late." She stepped closer, her eyes sharp with fire. "Then help us end it." A long silence. Then slowly the old man nodded. That night, the village gathered on the sacred ground behind the elder hut, the place where none had dared walk for decades. Under the moonlight, they dug until they found the altar again. Root-wrapped, blood-stained, waiting. The ritual they prepared was not one of summoning but release. The stranger translated the forgotten script, the counter-rite, buried in the final pages of the scrolls. It would not be easy. The spirit who had accepted the village's bargains would not give up its harvest willingly. The ritual circle was drawn in ash and salt. In the center, Zena stood, the last bride. Around her, villagers lit fires and hummed the old protection chants. The stranger placed the golden ring her family had accepted in the fire. The same ring that sealed the deal. The flames turned blue. A wind rose, hot and twisting, filled with voices not of this world. The air thickened, and shadows around the altar began to pulse and breathe. Something ancient stirred, not just in the ground but in their blood. Then it came. Not as a beast. Not as a god. But as a woman. Her eyes were coal, her mouth a hollow wail, and her skin shimmered like molten gold. She was made from every bride they had taken. She was their pain made flesh. She looked at Xena and smiled with broken teeth. You dare to break what fed you. I was never yours to claim, Xena said, steady. I am not the sacrifice. I am the end. The spirit lunged. The fire roared. But the stranger stepped between them and held up the burned ledger. As it caught flame, so did the names, and with each name consumed, the spirit screamed. Xena began to chant the reversal rite. Her voice cracked but did not falter. The villagers joined her. Even her father. Even the elders who had once paid with daughters and silence. The spirit shrieked, writhing, shrinking. And then silence. A wind passed through the crowd and the fire turned to embers. The altar cracked. The ashes settled. The curse was broken. Xena collapsed into the stranger's arms, her breath ragged. Her eyes met his, and in them she saw not victory but peace. In the days that followed, the elders stepped down. The ledger was buried with the altar's ashes. A new tradition was born, not of sacrifice but of remembrance. Each year they would gather and read the names of the women who were taken. They would plant trees where their graves might lie. They would no longer be forgotten. Her father came to her one morning and fell to his knees. I cannot ask for forgiveness. You cannot have it, she said. But you can make sure no one else needs to forgive you again. And so he did. As for the stranger, he did not stay in the village. His path was elsewhere. But before he left, he carved one last name in the ledger before the fire took it. His sister. And beside it, free. Xena watched him go, a part of her heart going with him, not out of love but out of shared survival. He had not saved her. And she had not saved him. But together they had unchained something far greater than pain. They had returned truth to the living. The village had begun Thiel, its soil no longer cursed with blood pacts or whispered names. But Xena knew the curse had not truly ended, not yet. The spirit was gone, the ledgers burned, the altar shattered. But something still pulsed in the bones of the land. A residue. A breath not yet exhaled. She felt it in the way the trees trembled without wind. In the dreams that still haunted her sleep. In the stranger's eyes, the way they had darkened little by little since the ritual. He had begun to fade. Not from her life but from this world. The village healer, old Mama Doro, confirmed it. She had seen it once before, she said, when a pact is reversed the energy must go somewhere. A tether had formed between Xena and the stranger during the ritual. She had been the final bride, and he had been the one to carry the names of the forgotten. The spirit had latched onto that link. And now, it would drain him until the last of its echo was silenced, unless it was given a final offering. But the spirit is gone, Xena whispered. What offering does it still demand? Mama Doro hesitated, eyes heavy with old knowing. Not to the spirit. To the wound. You cleanse the body, child. Now you must cleanse the soul. And that needs a sacrifice from the heart, something given freely, not torn. Xena understood. The pattern had always been about taking. Daughters taken, choices taken, voices silenced. Now something must be given, willingly, lovingly. The curse would not lift by force. It would only dissolve through surrender. And the only thing she had left to surrender was him. That night, Xena and the stranger sat by the river's edge, where reeds hummed with frogs and the moon carved silver across the water. He knew. She could see it in his stillness. He no longer touched the ground the same way. No longer blinked like a man made of skin and hope. Something inside him had already stepped one foot into the in-between. I don't want to lose you, she said, barely louder than the wind. You won't, he said gently. Not if you remember me for who I was before they turned me into a key. Tears gathered in her eyes. You were never a key. You were the only door that didn't lock when I knocked. He smiled at that. Then let me leave open. The final offering did not require blood. No fire. No chant. Just truth. Xena walked with him to the sacred tree that had grown where the altar once stood. Its bark shimmered faintly, its roots fed not by gold but by memory. Around it were the names of the women who had once been taken. Carved softly into the wood. Watered. She placed her hand on the trunk, the other in his. And she said, I give back the love I found in pain. I give him not to the curse but to the earth. To freedom. Not to bind him, to release him. The wind stopped. The tree sighed. And then he let go of her hand. His body began to glow softly, like mist catching dawnlight. He looked down at his fingers, surprised, but peaceful. He turned to her one last time. Tell the next girls they don't have to be chosen. They can choose. And then he was gone. No ash, no scream. Just silence, and the faint scent of Mariella blossoms. Xena dropped to her knees. She had loved him. Not in the way stories force hearts together, but in the way two souls that have bled the same find shelter in one another. Losing him didn't break her, it completed her sacrifice. Because this time she had chosen to give. The curse was not just undone. It was healed. The days that followed were quiet. But the land changed. Birdsong returned in the mornings. Babies were born without sickness. The river, once brown and hesitant, flowed clear again. And Xena? She did not hide her tears. She spoke of him often, to the children, to the elders. She planted a tree beside the sacred one, and each year she added one story to its bark. Stories of him. Of her. Of all who had been silenced but rose anyway. She was not just the girl who broke a curse. She was the woman who rewrote what love could mean, and what giving could heal. And every full moon, when the light touched the river just right, she swore she saw him, just beyond the bend. Smiling. Free. The morning the curse lifted, the village woke not to drums or chants, but to stillness. A quiet so deep it hummed with possibility. No smoke from offerings. No crying from hidden corners. Just the sound of birds, so many birds, as if the trees themselves had been waiting for song. Xena stood at the threshold of her old home, barefoot in the red dust, her face turned to the rising sun. She could feel it, not just on her skin but in her chest. The knot that had lived there since childhood, tied by years of secrets and silent fear, had come undone. Behind her, the village slowly emerged. Women peeked from behind curtains. Children chased one another without being hushed. And for the first time in years, no one whispered about gold. Her father didn't come out. Not yet. He was still reckoning with the weight of what had been done in the name of prosperity. Xena didn't need his apology. The curse had never belonged to one man alone. It had lived in silence, in complicity, in tradition dressed as duty. And now that legacy was over. She turned toward the tree where the final offering had been made. It was taller. Somehow. Its leaves shimmered green-gold in the morning light. Its trunk pulsed faintly with life, not magic, life. And beside it stood a second tree, the one she had planted after the ritual. Smaller, humbler, but growing fast. From the base of both, new shoots had begun to sprout. New beginnings. Just as she was turning away, she heard footsteps, soft, deliberate. She froze, and then smiled. He was there. The stranger. No longer a vessel. No longer a symbol of anyone else's story. Just a man. Whole, present, real. She rushed forward, and for a moment neither spoke. Their hands met first, then their eyes. And then, a silence not of fear but of peace. I thought, she whispered. You had passed over. He nodded. I thought so too. But the land kept part of me. Not to bind me again, to give me back to myself. Xena laughed, short and shaky. Even the land is learning to let go. They walked through the village, not hiding, not hurried. Some stared. Some smiled. Some bowed their heads in shame. Xena nodded to all. There would be time for healing. For apologies. For rebuilding what had been broken. But now it was time to leave. They gathered little. A satchel each. A few seeds from the sacred trees. Some dried bread, a woven map made by a child who had once been mute but had found her voice in the wake of the ritual. At the edge of the village, Mama Doro waited. She gave Xena a small bundle wrapped in goatskin, herbs for strength, charcoal for protection, and a carved amulet shaped like a spiral. Not to remember the curse, she said, but to remember the climb out of it. Xena hugged her tightly. So did the stranger. And then, without ceremony or fanfare, they turned toward the road. It wasn't paved. It wasn't marked. It curved toward the hills like a question waiting to be answered. They walked side by side. They didn't speak of love, not yet. What they shared went deeper than naming. They had been forged in fire, separated by sacrifice and reunited by choice. That was enough for now. A breeze lifted dust around their ankles. A lizard darted across the path. Birds wheeled above. I don't know where this road goes, he said. Xena shrugged. That's what makes it ours. They passed through tall grass. Over creeks. Past trees bearing fruit they didn't recognize. At one point, they stopped to rest near a stone carved with ancient symbols. Xena traced them with her finger. Do you think this story ends here? He asked softly. She looked up. No. But for once, we get to write the next chapter ourselves. They camped under the stars that night. The fire crackled low. The stranger told her about his sister, the one he had lost, the one who first warned him in dreams. Xena told him about her mother, how her silence had always felt like a map with pieces missing. They shared stories not to fill space but to build it, together. In the morning they found a market town, bustling alive. No one knew their names there. They could be anyone. Xena sold some beads she had woven from dried grass. He helped an old man fix his cartwheel. They earned enough for a roof and 2 bowls of soup. It was simple. It was honest. It was freedom. One night as they sat outside watching the moon rise, he took her hand again. No gold, he said. No chains, she replied. No curse. No pretending. They leaned against each other, breathing in the life they had chosen. Not the one sold in marriage, not the one scripted by ancestors or bought by fear. A new kind of freedom. Built not on escape, but on return. To truth. To self. To each other. And as the stars wheeled overhead, the world at last felt wide enough for them both.